What sounds like fiction but is actually a real historical event. In 1980, Lake Pigner in Louisiana drained like a bathtub with the plug removed. Oil drillers on a rig in the lake had hit a mine shaft below. The rig, barges, a tugboat and part of a nearby island got sucked into the largest man-made whirlpool ever. It was a salt mine, and nobody died. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel in 1838 in which 4 shipwreck survivors, at the point of starvation, choose to resort to cannibalism. So they kill the young cabin boy, Richard Parker, and eat him. In 1884, a ship called the Mignonette sank. 4 crew members survived. At the point of starvation, they killed and ate the youngest of them, Richard Parker. The inspiration for the tiger's name in Life of Pi. In 1971, a teenage girl named Julianne Koch was on a plane that was struck by lightning and disintegrated in the air. She plummeted 3,000 meters strapped to her seat and landed in the Amazon rainforest. Her mom had been on the flight with her, and Julianne searched in vain for her mom, but Julianne was the sole survivor of the crash. She survived 11 days alone, treating her maggot-infested wounds with fuel and using tracking techniques her father had taught her, before she found a boat that she used to make her way back to civilization. What an absolute legend. The Soviet scientist starving to death saving the seed bank of Leningrad during Hitler's invasion in the winter of 1941 to 1942 despite it being full of corn, wheat and potatoes. Due to a military standoff that took years, 15 ships became stranded in an inland sea, and over 8 years formed a multinational ship-based society that even included its own currency. The escape from Antarctica by the members of the Antarctic expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. The stuff they went through was unbelievable. Their boat, the Endurance, was crushed by ice floes. They were stranded on the floes for over a year in temperatures well below freezing. They then took to 3 boats around 22 feet in length across the Antarctic Ocean looking for land. There were about 10 men in each boat. They missed reaching land by just a few miles at times. 2/3 of them got stranded on Elephant Island surrounded by ice while one of the boats went out in search of rescue. That boat made it through the Drake Passage, one of the deadliest places in the ocean. All but 3 of them got stranded with little food and water while the 3 men who left became the first people to cross South Georgia on foot. They found civilization, rescued the men who came through the Drake Passage, waited months until they could rescue those on Elephant Island. Every single person who came on the initial voyage survived, with the worst lasting consequence being a single foot amputation. I am shocked that this has not been made into a major movie or mini-series. The death of Ken Rex Mcelroy. He terrorized Skidmore, Missouri for decades, stalking, assaulting, murdering and raped 2 14-year-olds who were his wives. He had an expensive attorney so he was never charged. The law never helped the poor town. One day, the town gathered for a meeting on how to deal with McElroy. Details gets a little vague here, but apparently someone alerted the room that McElroy was in the bar up the street. Quietly and calmly, everyone got up and walked over to the bar. As McElroy got into his truck, someone shot him in the back of the head. The town just went back to their business. When the witnesses, like the entire town, were questioned, everyone claimed they didn't see anything. No one has ever been arrested. An English king named Ethelred, later called the Unready, took some troops to defend against a Viking invasion. The weather was bad, so a lot of the Vikings' ships crashed as they were landing. Ethelred thought that it would be dishonorable to attack them as they were stumbling onto shore, so he kept his troops back until the Vikings had a chance to get together and form proper battle lines before he attacked them. The better prepared Vikings then won the fight and slaughtered a bunch of Ethelred's men, and he and the rest were forced to run away while the Vikings went around pillaging. Also, his sobriquet does not mean unready in the modern sense, as in unprepared, but rather ill-advised. Ethelred, the name meaning well-advised, a hilarious pun. Jeanne de Clisson, 1300 to 1359, was married to a French nobleman who was beheaded for treason by the French king. Enraged, she sold their estate and purchased 3 black warships with red sails, and became a pirate queen of the English Channel who targeted French ships. She became known as the Lioness of Brittany, and in her 13 years of piracy she would slaughter every member of a ship's crew except for one so that last survivor could go back and tell the French king what had happened. Why do I feel like the 1300s never get talked about? Joshua Norton was just this random crazy guy from San Francisco who hated all this political nonsense that was going on at the time and figured he could do the job better at it himself. And thus the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico was born. While he held no real power, the people liked him so much that they treated him like royalty anyways. Any currency issued under his name was treated like real money at many establishments. One day, he was arrested by a private security force because of his mental health, which enraged practically all of San Francisco. The police chief let him go because he had committed no crime, and Norton gave an imperial pardon to the guy who arrested him. After this incident, any police officer Norton passed would salute him. Another time, when a riot had formed and was getting pretty violent, Norton simply stood in front of the mob and calmly prayed, which managed to disperse the mob. And that's not even a fraction of the crazy stuff that he did. Sergeant Stubby. During World War I, a soldier found a stray dog when training on the Yale University campus, and took a liking to him. The soldier snuck the dog onto the ship when he had to leave campus, and when the dog was found by the commanding officer, he was allowed to stay because he had learned how to salute. Stubby was injured a few times during the war, but he was useful with alerting his squad of surprise mustard gas attacks and gunshots before the human ear could detect the sound. He also found and comforted wounded soldiers and caught a German soldier by the leg of his pants until American soldiers got to him, aka the bestest boy to ever live. Reminds me of the Polish bear who fought in World War II and was promoted to corporal. Louis XIX was king of France for 20 minutes. The shortest war ever recorded was around 40 minutes long. During the Salem witch trials, dogs were also accused of witchcraft. 2 dogs were executed because of it. The East German balloon escape. In 1979, 2 families escaped East Germany to West Germany by a homemade hot air balloon. There's a couple great escapes, like when the border was still new and some geniuses got past by lowering a convertible until it was shorter than the gate's arm, and just gunned it through the checkpoint. In 2007, a paraglider got trapped in the updraft of 2 joining thunderstorms and was lifted to an altitude of 33,000 feet. She landed over 3 hours later about 60 kilometers north of her starting position, having survived extreme cold, lightning and lack of oxygen. That sounds scary. Imagine spending 3 hours in the sky and not being able to get back down. A Russian Tsar had a bomb thrown at him, avoided it, and thought it was a good idea to stay there to look at the damage. Enter second guy with bomb. Assuming you mean Alexander III, Lenin himself watched the execution of his brother in a slightly earlier assassination attempt. Probably that time the US government hooked listening equipment to a cat so it could spy on Russians, only to realize that cats don't follow commands, and then it got hit by a car. During World War I, the German Navy built a ship and painted it to make it look like a British ship called the RMS Carmania in order to infiltrate and destroy British convoys. On the ship's first outing, the first enemy it encountered was the real RMS Carmania, which promptly sunk it. Spider-Man meme. The Carrington event. In 1859, the Earth was hit by a geomagnetic storm from the sun. It caused auroras as far south as Rome. Telegraph wires caught fire, and in general it was chaos. If this happened today, it would likely cause massive blackouts for weeks or even months and cause trillions in damage. Please don't even make that suggestion. At least, not this year. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919. A tank filled with 2 gallons of molasses burst and sent a tidal wave of molasses through the streets of Boston. 21 people were killed. Imagine standing in the streets as a tidal wave of molasses approaches and just thinking to yourself, well, I guess this is how it ends. Death by molasses. The Roman Emperor Caligula once declared war against Neptune, god of the ocean. He led his soldiers to a beach and instructed them to stab the water. Would have won, too, had he recruited the sand guardian. In 1993, a man taught geese to follow his ultralight aircraft glider. They didn't know how to migrate, so he flew all the way to an area where geese generally migrate to with his geese following. This is a movie called Fly Away Home. Spartan weddings. Basically, young Spartans would train for years in camps, surrounded only by men. So, When the time came for marriage, the women would shave their heads and dress in men's clothing, since the idea of having sex with anyone other than a man weirded out the grooms. I don't know, man, sounds a little gay to me. Not exactly historical, but a poodle named Cachi, in Caballito, Buenos Aires, fell from 13 floors and fatally hit 75-year-old Marta Espina, killing both instantly. In the course of the events, 46-year-old Edith Sola, who came to see the incident, was fatally hit by a bus. An unidentified man, who witnessed Edith's death, had an heart attack and also died on his way to the hospital. Mad Jack Churchill, the man with the only confirmed longbow kill in World War II, a guy and his squad did a death march towards the Germans all playing bagpipes, got captured and sent to a concentration camp. He then escaped, got caught again, and then escaped a different concentration camp. Also, he always carried a Scottish longsword with him. There's so much other weird crap he did after the war, and it's amazing to me that he's entirely real. During World War I, the German Empire bombarded Osawik fortress with gas that the Russian Empire was defending. After some time, the Russian soldiers charged at the now entrenched German positions, covered in their own blood, bloodshot eyes, coughing up portions of their lungs. The German army began to open fire with rifles and machine gun fire, but later retreated because the look of the Russian soldiers was told that they looked like the undead, which the event was now known as the Attack of the Dead Men. Bulgarian swineherd, King Ivalo the swineherd, became a king and won a battle against the trained army of the current king of that time. In 1962, in Peru, 2 American scientists reported a massive slab of rock undermined a glacier on Huascaran, 6,768 meters above the sea. It was printed in the newspaper, and the government ordered to retract or prison time. They fled the country. 8 years later, an earthquake made a mudslide and buried the town of Yungay. The excavation is forbidden by the government. Population before mudslide was 20k, only survived 400. When you read the real John Brown story, from Kansas to Harper's Ferry, it just doesn't seem real. Fundraising, Canada, clandestine fundraising, religion, asking everyone to join, betrayal by friends, martyrdom, etc. John Wilkes Booth was at his execution. And part of the army forces sent to capture him were Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart. In 1985, Philadelphia police bombed a residential neighborhood. The resulting explosion destroyed 2 city blocks, killing 5 children and 6 adults. I watched that fire from my house just outside of West Philly. I'm shocked at how many people have no knowledge of the 5th largest city dropping a bomb on itself that resulted in the deaths of 11 citizens and the destruction of 61 houses. The life of Harriet Tubman, one of the rare examples of someone who is a household name for being a badass who was actually about 10 times more badass than people know about. Things she did other than the Underground Railroad. 1. She financed and recruited for John Brown's Harper's Ferry slave revolt raid, and the only reason she didn't fight in person was she was bedridden with malaria. 2. During the Civil War, she joined the Union Army as a cook nurse. 3. She somehow class shifted into a spy scout and helped Union leaders plan raids into Confederate territory, and she assassinated several Confederates. 4. She rose in the ranks until she commanded a small raiding force of 300 Union troops from the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the second black US Army unit ever. 5. Her command, Company C, 54th, raided southern plantations, slaughtered slave drivers, and freed captive slaves. 6. In the Combahee Ferry raid, where the 54th freed 700 slaves, she was also in command of 3 Union frigates, and when a Confederate division was advancing on them, she fired broadsides from the 3 naval warships directly into the enemy troops. 7. She survived the war, and immediately turned around and started fighting for women's suffrage. 9. Italian geologist being charged with manslaughter for not predicting an earthquake. I don't know if this counts as a historical event, because it happened in 2010, but the owner of the Segway company, Jimmy Heselden, died by driving a Segway off a cliff near his estate in Yorkshire. In July 1518, residents of the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, was struck by a sudden and seemingly uncontrollable urge to dance. The hysteria kicked off when a woman known as Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to silently twist, twirl and shake. She kept up her solo dance-a-thon for nearly a week, and before long, some 3 dozen other Strasbourgians had joined in. By August, the dancing epidemic had claimed as many as 400 victims. The strange episode didn't end until September, when the dancers were whisked away to a mountaintop shrine to pray for absolution. The funny thing is that there is not really an explanation for what happened. Explanations range from medical issues known as hot blood, to curses being placed on people. They died of disco fever. The entire life of Julie d'Aubigny, bisexual swordmaster, heartthrob turned opera singer who lived her life entirely for the lols, beat the crap out of dudes in sword duels, and doing it topless whenever anyone doubted she was a lady, got in trouble for making out with ladies at royal balls, once became a nun to frick a nun and then set fire to the convent. Crap is so wild, it's insane there's not a blockbuster movie about her. Yes. The story of the whale ship Essex, where a sperm whale sunk a whale ship. The crew survived on the ship's whaleboats for about 2 months, eventually resorting to cannibalism and drawing lots to see who would be eaten. It inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dong. Probably the guy that attached weather balloons to a lawn chair and rose up over 15,000 feet in the air. He brought only a pellet gun to shoot balloons, a CB radio, sandwiched, and some beer, and accidentally went into restricted airspace and had to contact the FAA. Russia's fake Dmitry, Ivan the Terrible's son, assassinated at the age of 8. 9 years later, a guy claims to be the Dmitry, having had survived the assassination attempt. He gains the throne and rules for 11 months, then dragged from the palace and publicly executed. Mark the end of false Dmitry 1. Then it gets interesting. The next year a second imposter declared himself Dmitry, but doesn't dispute Dmitry 1's legitimacy, instead claiming to be the same guy, having miraculously survived his apparent execution a year before, and somehow wins political support of Dmitry 1's widow, and with her support gains the allegiance of the Cossacks, rallies an army of over 10,000 strong and tries to take back the throne. Though is mostly failed, he conquers most of southeastern Russia and rule until his untimely death 3 years later, after being beheaded by a Tatar prince in a drunken altercation. Mark end of false Dmitry 2. 3 months later, when impostor 3 pops up, apparently magically appearing from behind a waterfall in Ivangorod, and declared himself Tsar. He follows Dmitry 2's lead and doesn't dispute the other 2 imposters, instead claiming some sort of spiritual reincarnation or magical resurrection. To establish himself as the same guy, he managed to win support of the same Cossacks who supported Dmitry 2's claim. He was forced to flee his stronghold only a year later, where he was speared on the way to Moscow and secretly executed, though he never actually ruled. Historians stuck with the theme, naming him false Dmitry 3. History gets fuzzy here, with some source citing a false Dmitry 4, while others say it is counting Dmitry 3 twice. Fake Dmitry 1 was a known fake. The powers that be used him until he was trouble and then executed him. The quartered him, cremating what was left, stuffed the ashes in a can, and shoot him in a cannon back to Poland, where he was from. In the Middle Ages, gays and lesbians would become nuns and monks to avoid persecution, and since religion was a heavy influence in those days, it was seen as noble that they were dedicating themselves to God. They would have special friends, and since no one could get pregnant, it wasn't that big of an issue. That's still going on. The USSR sent turtles to the moon and they came back, making them the first organisms to return from a flyby of the moon. Mercier one-upped them by sending Neil Armstrong though. Robert Smalls. Thank you. Wiki. Born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina, he freed himself, his crew, and their families during the American Civil War by commandeering a Confederate transport ship, CSS Planter, in Charleston Harbor, on the 13th of May, 1862, and sailing it from Confederate-controlled waters of the harbor to the US blockade that surrounded it. He then piloted the ship to the Union-controlled enclave in Beaufort Port Royal Hilton Head area, where it became a Union warship. His example and persuasion helped convince President Abraham Lincoln to accept African American soldiers into the Union Army. During the Cold War, Americans wanted to intimidate the Russians, so they dropped extra large condoms labeled small on the Russian army so the Russians would think all Americans had huge butt-dongs and they would feel inadequate. In their search for gold in El Dorado, the Spanish conquistadors regularly found large amounts of platinum. Spain had a problem with people counterfeiting gold coins using platinum, so they tossed their entire platinum supply into the ocean. Or, they were so blinded by their greed for gold that they dumped a metal more valuable into the ocean, thinking it worthless, as Red from Oz put it. This whole debacle is such an incredibly apt metaphor for the flaws inherent in the colonial system and how the lust for gold literally blinded them to the true unique value of the New World that if I'd read it in a book I would have called the writer a hack. A guy was in Hiroshima when the first atomic bomb landed. He survived, then went to Nagasaki a few days later because he didn't want to miss a day at work. He also got hit by the second bomb. He survived both attacks. Violet Jessup, also known as Miss Unsinkable, was a nurse on the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic ships and survived them all. With such characters as Go by the Wall and Tickle the Bricks and Iceberg Charlie, wrote a giant memoir about it and died on the 5th of May, 1971. Side note I thought I should mention, during the sinking of the Britannic, Iceberg Charlie turned on the propeller thinking they can book it to the mainland, not realizing that lifeboats had already been let down. The propeller started chopping up the lifeboats and the people inside them like a giant Vitamix. Violet's lifeboat was heading right towards the propeller and everyone else jumped into the water to swim away. Also, Violet couldn't swim, so she had to jump in the water and get pulled around by the force of the propeller until she reached the surface once again. During World War II, there were Coca-Cola Soldiers in American front lines setting up Coca-Cola production to provide soldiers with a reminder of home and a morale boost. Dr. Robert Liston performed an operation that ended up with a 300% mortality rate. He was amputating a leg of a patient. During this he sliced off the fingers of an assistant. They both died of infection. He also slashed the coattails of a spectator, who was so terrified that the knife pierced his vital organs that he died from fright. Apparently, the third guy didn't die, just fainted, according to the original record. The original record was an account given by a surgeon author who may or may not have made it, and other stories about Liston. Up. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.